Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not going well. President Vladimir Putin is now discussing using nuclear weapons. Does this mean Putin has gone mad? Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Matt Gnezda, filling in for Chris while he's on vacation. So, Russian President Vladimir Putin is not afraid to kill. Although guns aren't really his style. The only guns Putin's rocking are those arm cannons. Pew pew! Anyway, Putin prefers poison. He's been accused of poisoning his most prominent critic, as well as a former Russian spy, as well as another former Russian spy and his daughter. Okay, so Putin only succeeded at killing one of them, but it's the thought that counts. Literally, that's the difference between first and second degree murder. Under Putin, Russia also invaded the Ukrainian peninsula Crimea. He was also prime minister when Russia invaded Georgia. And now he's invaded Ukraine, saying he wants to denazify the country through his special military operation. Great. As if it wasn't bad enough when everyone was calling each other Nazis on Twitter, now we're making it a military operation. Some might just write this off as Putin having a Napoleon complex. You know, the guy who tried to take over the world supposedly to compensate for his shortness. Putin is kind of short, but there could be other reasons.
You said you know he doesn't have a soul.
I did say that to him, yes. And his response was, we understand one another.
Putin was probably just messing with him. But I'm not ruling out the possibility that Putin is actually a vampire. Some are seriously starting to question Putin's mental state and whether he's living in the reality everyone else is. You see, Russia didn't have the kind of quick victory in Ukraine many thought it would. Russia's military is much bigger than Ukraine's. Where Russia has 900,000 active personnel in its armed forces and 2 million in reserve, Ukraine only has 196,000 and 900,000 reservists. Russia's defense budget is almost 10 times the size of Ukraine's. And Russia has a lot more military vehicles and weapons, including nuclear weapons. Despite that, Russia has so far failed to take over Ukraine's airspace. And Russia apparently can't get oil to its tanks, which means they're pretty useless. Unless you're playing hide and seek. They'll never find me here. The US estimates up to 6,000 Russian soldiers died in the first 2 weeks of fighting. Given all this, I think it's safe to say things are not going as planned for Putin. One of the reasons people are starting to question Putin's sanity is that he's brought nuclear weapons into the equation. On Sunday, he ordered Russia's nuclear weapons forces to be put on high alert. Georgia's former president says Putin is now out of his mind. Latvia's former president says Putin has always been evil, but now he's also unhinged. And a former US ambassador to Russia says he sounds completely disconnected from reality. And I say, he's a vampire. And former US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice agrees. Not with the vampire part, but with the other things.
Well, I met with him many times, and this is a different Putin. He was always calculating and cold, but this is different. He seems erratic. There is an ever-deepening delusional rendering of history. He's descending into something that I personally haven't seen before.
One thing all these people have in common is that they've all dealt with Putin. So, are they right that there's been a change in Putin's mental state? More on that after the break. Welcome back. Putin has been called a madman with nuclear weapons after he invaded Ukraine and then put Russia's nuclear weapons forces on high alert. A madman prepping his nukes for use. Man, remember the good old days when all we had to worry about was a global pandemic and potential civil war in the US? Those were the days. But has Putin actually lost his mind? Some say his behavior over Ukraine proves he has.
This behavior is different than in the past, and I don't understand at all putting the nuclear forces on alert. This all seems to me like, in some respect, he's gone off the rails. Maybe it's 2 years of isolation at his dacha outside of Moscow. I don't know, but this behavior is different, and it's very worrisome.
Wait, are they blaming COVID isolation for his desire to nuke the world? man, why couldn't Putin have just developed a hobby like the rest of us, like stamp collecting or opioid addiction? That joke may be dark, but it's also statistically accurate. At least Putin is still social distancing. However, this isn't the first time people have questioned Putin's sanity. Back in 2014, German Chancellor Angela Merkel said she was not sure Putin was in touch with reality. As Russia invaded Crimea, she reportedly described him as being in another world. He was in Crimea. And even before this latest invasion of Ukraine, interest in Putin's mental state was high, so high that there were even studies done on it. 2 studies were conducted for the Pentagon, one in 2008 and another in 2011. The 2008 study speculated that Putin might have Asperger's syndrome, which is a form of autism. That would explain why Putin doesn't seem to be afraid of using nukes. He's too autistic to look fear in the eye. Some of the symptoms of Asperger's are being hyper-focused, having an eye for detail, and having trouble with social interactions. For example, if someone bumps into you, instead of saying, "Excuse me," you might try to poison their entire family. One researcher who worked on the study believes Putin's neurological development was significantly interrupted in infancy. But that's just a theory. Researchers can't prove it, since they would need to actually do a brain scan to know for sure. Since Putin came to power in 1999, the US intelligence community has been trying to figure out how he thinks, and apparently it's not easy. But what is clear to many is that Putin believes in a revisionist history and feels aggrieved by it. You see, he believes that Ukraine isn't really a country, and that Russia and Ukrainians are one people separated by an artificial border. He even wrote an article about this. And it's true that what's now Ukraine was once part of the Russian Empire. In fact, my great-grandparents fled to America from the Kiev region in 1906 after realizing they were actually in Russia. But Ukraine has been an independent country since 1991. That's why Putin's belief in a historical Russia is one reason he views the collapse of the Soviet Union as a tragedy, which he said several times before. Because of this belief, invading Ukraine was, in his mind, just liberating a part of Russia, not invading a sovereign nation. If you thought critical race theory was bad, critical Russia theory is even worse.
He's been stewing in a combustible combination of grievance and ambition for many years.
But CIA Chief William Burns says Putin's inner circle has gotten smaller and smaller, and that people who question Putin often don't move up the ranks. Yeah, the only place those people get moved up to is heaven. This is a problem for a lot of autocrats. They surround themselves with yes men. Okay, surround might be too strong of a word. But the point is, these people are afraid to say things that challenge Putin's assumptions. Things like, Ukraine is a sovereign country, or if you invade Ukraine, Russia might not win, or would you please just put on a shirt already? So maybe Putin miscalculated because he had bad intelligence, or his yes men were too scared to advise him not to invade. We don't know. But it now seems clear he's desperate to win the war, even if it means using nuclear weapons. Now, risking nuclear war may sound pretty crazy for most people, but for autocrats like Putin, this could actually be logical. See, if they can set the stakes so high that their enemy backs down, then they will have won without any more fighting. And one thing that separates autocrats like Putin from leaders of liberal democracies is that autocrats are often willing to sacrifice almost anything to get what they want. Another theory is that Putin could just be pretending to be a madman. If only he pretended to be more of a Don Draper madman and less of a Pol Pot. I'll have more on that after this final commercial break. Welcome back. Many people are questioning Putin's sanity after Russia invaded Ukraine. Putin may be mad, but he also might be pretending to be mad. Here's why. There's a theory out there that if someone like Putin can convince people he's this crazy dictator with nukes who's so out of control that he might actually use them, then maybe they'll give him what he wants. If US officials fear that Putin might be crazy enough to do anything, including use of nuclear weapons, then they might be more cautious about aiding Ukraine and sanctioning Russia. That's a slippery slope, though, because Putin could just use the nuke card to get whatever he wants in the future. Poland? Nukes. Keeping other countries from joining NATO? Nukes. A sequel to White Chicks? Nukes. Wow, he is crazy. But there's also a downside to this crazy. And that is, if people believe Putin's really mad, They won't trust him to keep his promises. And if he can't be trusted to keep his promises, appeasing him won't work. So if Putin says, stop the sanctions or I'll use nuclear weapons, stopping sanctions would bring no guarantee that Putin wouldn't use nuclear weapons. The explanation I'm leaning towards is that Putin is not mad, he's simply frustrated. Even though he's gaining ground in Ukraine, Putin is paying a much higher cost than he anticipated. And there doesn't seem to be a way for him to exit gracefully, at least not with his reputation intact. He wasn't counting on this, which is strange since I thought vampires love counting. So what do you think? Has Putin gone crazy? Leave your comments below. And if you like this show, and I know you do, remember that we rely mainly on direct support from viewers like you, not on YouTube ad revenue. So please visit our new locals community at americauncovered.locals.com. Become a supporter so you can help us keep making great episodes. Click the link below. Once again, I'm Matt Gnezda. Chris will be back on Saturday. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.